All right, so this one happened in round 8, and Danny and Marty, I guess, were 7. No, they were 6-1 by then, and they debated the University of Kansas. The University of Kansas was very good. They were a top 10 team. Well, I got to back up a little bit. One of the things that I talked about in the previous story was Harvard ran a new affirmative against Baylor. Well, this is something that back then, and even till today, happens a lot at nationals because the data gathering, the intelligence gathering about what everybody's running and what arguments everybody is running is very extensive. But the one thing you can do is, if you have an argument that you have never run at a tournament, you can keep it secret till the first time it's broken out. And so people put together lots of new affirmatives for debates where they really want to control things or where they want their opponent on the negative to really have to scramble and put something together out of the all-purpose research that they did all season. So Danny and Marty, getting it together for nationals that year, they wrote one affirmative about helping Cameroon build a navy, and you're going to hear about that in the next story because it was the affirmative that they ran in the octafinals. They ran it once in the prelims, and that didn't go too well. I may talk about that in the next story. And then they wrote another new affirmative, which was a version of their old affirmative, and it exempted Egypt from having... They were going to lose all their foreign aid for being in arrears on their debt, having gone 12 months without it, and the affirmative Danny and Marty had run for almost the entire spring semester had been to let them reallocate some of their other foreign aid money to service their debt. But one of the new affirmatives that they were carrying for nationals, and you're going to hear about this because they ran it in the semis, was to exempt one water project. To let the aid cutoff happen to all the rest of the aid package we give to Egypt, but to cut out a loophole for one water project, and I'll talk about that down the road. But Marty had been working on a third new affirmative, and it had to do with Somalia, giving aid to Somalia, or I think sanctioning Somalia, because Somalia had had a lot of upheaval in its government in the days and weeks coming up to nationals. And so Marty had found a whole lot of the internal link evidence, the impact evidence, advocacy, knew what the plan was going to say, but he just couldn't get the affirmative to come together. He kept running into problem arguments that he knew that we would not have a good position on, and so he finally got frustrated, and he packaged all of it up to carry with him, thinking that at nationals this stuff might be useful, and he'd put a lot of labor hours into it. And then just a couple of days before nationals, there were some stories that came out in the paper that there had been a purge, that the prime minister of Somalia had eliminated a lot of cabinet officials who were at the root of the problem, and Marty just rolled his eyes and said, okay, that idea for an affirmative is dead. And then Danny started picking on him for, then why are we carrying all this Somalia stuff around? Okay, are you going to see this coming? Round 8. University of Kansas, quite a good team. They're affirmative. They're running a new affirmative. So, they start off the 1AC with contention 1, and the Kansas is known for having puns in their 1AC, and the one that I still remember is... Wait, it may not be... I don't think it was Somalia. I think it may have been the Sudan. They both start with S, and I get them confused. But the first contention was labeled Gloom and Doom Loom in Khartoum, which got a big laugh out of everybody. But as soon as Marty figured out what it was, he gave Danny, I've never seen one this big before, they high-fived, but on Marty's side, it was a roundhouse high-five. He almost came up out of his chair to do it, and then he dove over the chair, did not climb out of the chair, dove over the back of it to get to his files, pulled out, he had to do this with his hands to get a grip on all of it, pulled out all the Somalia stuff, and went kaboom on the table. Meanwhile, poor Barry Pickens, the 2A for Kansas, he looks over what's happening over the Baylor table, and his eyes go... So then Danny, who's extraordinarily fast, has one off-case argument in the 1NC. It is the Zhongli disadvantage. The Zhongli disadvantage, there was a desert restoration project, and the Zhongli disadvantage was going to wreak ecological havoc all over that entire part of Africa, and then they had snowball evidence, species extinction evidence, and the impact was extinction of all life on Earth. Well, Barry had never heard of the Zhongli project, had no idea what it was, had not a single piece of evidence to answer it. Danny, having read the Zhongli disadvantage at warp speed, gets to the case and starts with the evidence from 2 days before that there's been a purge, that the Prime Minister has wiped out all the problem people in the cabinet, and Kansas's entire case has just gone away. But he doesn't stop there. He then proceeds to read all sorts of offensive arguments all over the case. I mean, there's no making unevidenced arguments, questioning, well, this evidence says might, it might not. There's none of that. It is just an evidence dump. Marty has done all this research. He's been so frustrated that it's not going to get used, and now it's all getting used. And so then poor Barry Pickens in the 2AC, he reads his evidence that the government is still unstable and that there are members of the cabinet who are radical Muslims and part of the problem. But his evidence is like 2 weeks old, and ours is 2 days old. And it talks about events that have happened since his evidence was published that completely undercuts the viability of the affirmative. Marty, just for the fun of it, spends the entire 10 minutes of the 2NC, this is back when we had 10-minute constructives and 5-minute rebuttals, on the Zhongli disadvantage, because poor Barry Pickens has just been reading his generic impact arguments that the environment's very resilient and species extinction clears out niches for new species, and Marty deals with those, and those are not that hard an argument to beat. And Barry didn't get to spend that much time on the Zhongli disadvantage because there was so much he had to answer on the case. But Marty just read all these really good initial link cards and really good internal link cards, even though that hadn't been challenged, just because there was all this pent-up frustration, and it's almost like he was, swatting at a mosquito that had bitten him or something. He was taking out all of this angst he had about not being able to make the Somalia affirmative come together. So that debate was pretty mercifully clear-cut, and it was a 3-0 for Baylor, and it kind of sets up what happened in the quarterfinals. I'll tell you, after the tournament was over, I had a lot of sympathy for Barry Pickens. But that's story number 2, and story number 3, which you can see tomorrow, will be about the octafinals and about Baylor running the Cameroonian Navy's affirmative against a couple of freshmen who were unbelievably talented.